The train whistle screamed into the wide Montana sky before the iron beast groaned to a stop. Clara Dawson pressed her gloved hands together in her lap, willing her heart to steady. This was it, the end of the long journey and the beginning of her new life. Through the soot-streaked window, she saw nothing but open prairie stretching to the horizon, mountains rising like blue-gray sentinels in the distance. It was beautiful, wild, and nothing at all like the polished streets of St. Louis she had left behind. Here, in this harsh country, she was meant to become a bride. She rose when the porter announced the station, clutching her carpet-bag with trembling fingers. The other passengers bustled around her, farmers, merchants, families calling for loved ones. Clara stepped down onto the platform, her skirts brushing against the dusty planks, and searched the crowd for one familiar face. Thomas Avery, her fiancé, the man she had crossed half the country to wed. Her father had arranged the match, promising her security, a home, a future. She had told herself that love might come in time, that stability was enough. And yet, as she scanned the small throng of waiting townsfolk, no eager groom pushed through to greet her. Her smile faltered. Perhaps he was delayed. Perhaps he waited by the church, expecting her there. A matronly woman gave her a pitying look as she passed. A pair of young boys snickered openly. Clara's cheeks burned. She drew herself tall, reminding herself that she was a Dawson of good breeding, and walked forward, each step echoing the hollow sound of hope clinging to silence. The station emptied. The train hissed, then rumbled back down the tracks, leaving only drifting smoke in its wake. Clara stood alone on the platform, a bride without a groom, in the middle of Montana's endless wilderness. Her heart gave a hard, painful thud. He wasn't here. The little whitewashed church stood at the edge of town, its steeple pointing bravely toward heaven, as if to defy the wind that scoured the prairie. Clara's boots crunched over gravel as she approached, the sound much too loud in the silence that surrounded her. She had told herself that Thomas must be here, waiting with flowers, with a smile, with some reasonable excuse for not meeting her at the station. A groom might be late, but surely a groom did not forget. Pushing the heavy door open, Clara stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of pine wood and candle wax, and her gaze swept over the empty pews. No guests, no minister, no Thomas. Her throat tightened. She set her bag down on the nearest pew and pressed her hand to her corseted waist. "Perhaps I am early," she whispered to herself, though she knew the train had arrived precisely on schedule. Minutes trickled into an hour. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, cutting through the stained glass, marking the time she tried desperately not to count. Each creak of the door made her start, but it was only the wind. Her chest ached with the weight of silence. At last, a kindly old minister entered, hat in hand. He looked at her with weary eyes, and she saw the truth before he spoke. "Miss Dawson," he said gently, "I fear Thomas Avery has left town 2 days past. No one knows where he's gone." The words crashed into her like a blow. Clara's vision blurred, her hands trembling so badly she nearly toppled. The minister caught her elbow, steadying her, but she hardly felt his touch. Gone. Her groom, her promised future, her father's plan to secure her place. All vanished into the thin Montana air. Somewhere outside, laughter drifted on the wind, boys mocking the bride with no groom. The shame seared deeper than the sun overhead. Clara lifted her chin, forcing herself not to cry in front of strangers, though inside her heart, fractured into pieces sharp enough to bleed. She was abandoned, a bride without a wedding, a woman alone in a town that already whispered about her. Clara remained seated in the empty church long after the minister had gone. The afternoon light shifted, turning the stained glass crimson and gold, but she did not move. Her gloves lay limp in her lap, her eyes fixed on the altar that was meant to witness her vows. Every tick of the silence pressed heavier on her chest. She could feel the absence more than she could feel the air around her. It was as if even God himself had looked away. But the silence did not last. The door creaked open again, and a pair of women slipped in, neighbors dressed in their Sunday best, though it was not Sunday. Their eyes flicked to Clara, then darted away, though not before she caught the flicker of pity, and worse, amusement. "She's still waiting?" one whispered far too loudly. "A groom who runs is no groom at all," the other replied, the words slicing sharp as knives. The women left with their whispers trailing behind them, and soon others came, curious, pretending piety as they peeked in on the abandoned bride. Some shook their heads, some smirked. The gossip spread faster than wildfire in dry grass. Poor thing, traveled all that way. Didn't even last a day before he ran. Must have learned something he didn't like about her. Clara sat straighter, refusing to crumble before their eyes, but her cheeks burned and her throat stung with unshed tears. She wanted to flee, but where? There was no family here, no friends, no future, only a ghost of a wedding and the ashes of a name already beginning to blacken in strangers' mouths. At last the church emptied again, though the echoes of their whispers clung to her ears. Alone in the pew, Clara closed her eyes and drew a trembling breath. She would not weep, she would not beg, she would endure. Yet in her heart, humiliation rooted itself deep, twisting tight around her hope. When Clara finally stepped out of the church, the late afternoon sun was merciless. It beat down on her bonnet and lit her pale face for all to see. She had hoped to slip quietly away. But there was no quiet in a town as small as this. They were waiting for her. Not in a line, not in a crowd, but in little knots. Women with baskets on their arms, men leaning against posts, children darting between skirts, all pretending to go about their business, but every eye turned toward the bride who never wed. "Poor dear," a grey-haired woman murmured, though loud enough for Clara to hear. "Travelled so far, only to be left with nothing." A younger one sniffed, lips curling. Well, perhaps he saw through her before it was too late. The men did not bother to soften their tones. "Fool girl, a woman should know better than to chase a man out here. Pretty enough, I suppose, but not enough to keep a groom." Laughter rippled. Clara's stomach clenched as though each word were a stone hurled at her ribs. She held her head high, but her hands trembled around the handle of her carpet bag. Children whispered and pointed. "That's her," one boy giggled, "the bride with no husband." Clara forced herself forward, step after step across the dusty street, as if dignity could be stitched together from sheer will alone. But each whisper caught on her like burrs, clinging, pricking, cutting. Forsaken, foolish, alone. Her vision blurred with unshed tears. Still she pressed on, refusing to let them see her break. It was then she heard it. Another voice, deeper, harder, slicing through the gossip like a blade through rope. "Enough!" The word cracked across the air. The townsfolk fell silent, heads turning as Marshal Elias Kane stepped out of the shadows of the general store, his broad frame outlined against the fading sun. His hat shaded his eyes, but even so Clara thought she saw a strange glint there, sharp, golden, almost feral. For the first time that day, the whispers stopped. The sun pressed down harder with every step Clara forced herself to take. The dusty street seemed to stretch for miles, though it was no more than a few yards wide. The whispers still stung in her ears, her breath grew shallow, and the edges of her vision wavered. She told herself to keep walking, to prove them all wrong, to stand tall, no matter the shame. But her body betrayed her. The heat bore down like a hammer, the air thick in her throat. Her knees buckled, her carpet bag slipped from her grasp, and the world tilted sideways. Gasps rose from the crowd. A few women clutched their skirts, others stepped back. Not a soul moved forward, no one but him. Strong arms caught her before she struck the ground. Clara's lashes fluttered open, just enough to glimpse the hard line of a jaw shadowed with stubble, the brim of a black hat, and eyes that burned an unnatural gold in the fading light. "Easy now," a low voice rumbled, steady as stone. "I've got you." The townsfolk parted without a word, as Marshal Elias Kane lifted the fainting bride into his arms, as if she weighed no more than a child. His stride was unhurried, certain, and not a single whisper dared follow him. Clara's head rested against the coarse fabric of his uniform, the faint scent of pine and leather surrounding her. Somewhere in the haze of her mind, she realized this was no dream. A stranger, stern, silent, impossibly strong, was carrying her away from her shame. and for the first time since she stepped off the train, Clara Dawson felt safe. When Clara awoke, the ceiling above her was not the vaulted wood of the church, nor the painted plaster of home, but rough-hewn beams blackened by smoke. For a moment she did not know where she was, then she felt the weight of a quilt across her, heavy and warm, and smelled the faint, sharp scent of pine mingled with wood smoke. She sat up too quickly, her head swimming, and found herself on a narrow bed tucked against the wall of a small, tidy cabin. "You're awake." The voice came from the doorway. Clara's eyes lifted, and there he stood. Marshal Elias Kane, tall, broad-shouldered, a badge pinned to his chest, his hat now set aside to reveal dark hair touched with silver at the temples. His eyes, however, were what struck her most, an amber shade that seemed to catch and hold the firelight like molten gold. Clara clutched the quilt tighter around her. "Forgive me, I don't understand." "You fainted," Elias said simply, his tone clipped, matter of fact. "The heat, the stairs, you needed to be out of there." He stepped forward, setting a chipped mug of water on the small table beside her bed. "Drink." She obeyed, the cool water easing the tightness in her throat. When she lowered the mug, she managed, "You should have left me there. I don't want to be a burden." Something flickered across his face, too brief to name. "You're no burden. Not yet." He turned away, as though the conversation already bored him, and busied himself at the hearth where a small fire crackled. Clara looked around. The cabin was plain but sturdy, shelves lined with worn books, a rifle mounted above the door, boots neatly set by the wall. Everything had a place. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone and intended to keep it that way. "Is this your home?" she asked softly. "For now," he said, "and I'm to stay here?" His shoulders tensed. "Temporary, until you figure what's next. I don't take in strays." The words were cold, but his actions, bringing her here, giving her water, placing a quilt over her fainting body, spoke differently. Clara lowered her gaze, her heart thudding with confusion. "Thank you, Marshal Kane," she whispered. He said nothing more, only stirred the fire. But in the quiet she thought she heard his breath deepen, as though something inside him wrestled against the silence he kept. The next morning dawned grey, clouds rolling heavy over the mountains. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of boots moving across the wooden floor. Elias was already at the table, pouring the dark brew into a tin cup. His movements were steady, precise, the sort of motions a man makes when he has lived too long by routine. "Sleep well?" he asked without looking up. Clara hesitated. "Better than I expected." She rose, smoothing her wrinkled skirts, and crossed the small room. He slid a cup toward her, and when she reached for it, her fingers brushed his. Warmth shot through her, startling enough that she nearly spilled the drink. It was then she truly looked at him in the morning light. His eyes caught her breath. They weren't brown, as she had assumed in the dimness yesterday, nor hazel. They were a strange, arresting amber, golden, almost glowing. The color seemed too vivid for any man she had ever met, more beast than human, like the eyes of a wolf glimpsed by firelight. Clara's fingers tightened on her cup. For a heartbeat she couldn't look away. Elias noticed. He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Something wrong?" She swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "No, only. I've never seen eyes like yours." His jaw flexed. "Best not to stare too long, Miss Dawson. Folks say a man's eyes can tell you too much about him." The words sent a ripple of unease through her, though his tone was calm. She lowered her gaze, sipping the bitter coffee to cover her fluster. Still, she felt the weight of his stare lingering on her, as though he too was learning more than she wished to reveal. Outside, a wolf's distant howl carried faint on the wind. Clara shivered, the sound threading strangely with the memory of Elias's eyes. She wondered, though she dared not ask, what kind of man truly sat across the table from her. Later that evening, after the chores of the day were done and the prairie sank into quiet shadows, Clara found herself standing on the small porch of Elias Kane's cabin. The sky blazed with streaks of red and gold, fading into violet as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Elias leaned against the porch rail, his hat pulled low, arms folded across his broad chest. He had said little all day, moving with a silent efficiency that made her both grateful and unsettled. "You shouldn't linger out here alone," he said without looking at her. His voice was deep, steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. Clara drew her shawl tighter. "I'm not afraid of the dark." "You should be." His gaze finally turned to hers, and again she was caught by the unnatural amber of his eyes. They seemed to glow brighter as the light around them dimmed. This land isn't kind. Not to strangers, and not to women left without anyone to stand for them. Clara's throat tightened. She knew his words were true. She had felt the scorn of the townsfolk, the weight of their pity and laughter. Yet the way he spoke made her pulse quicken, as though he carried more warning than he dared reveal. "I'm thankful you've helped me," she said softly, "but if you don't wish me here, I can go. I don't want to be where I'm not wanted." For the first time, something cracked in his expression. Not anger, not coldness, but a flicker of loneliness, quickly masked. He pushed off the rail, his shadow stretching tall in the last of the light. "You can stay for now," he said. His jaw tightened. "But don't mistake my help for more than it is. I'm not the kind of man you can depend on, not for long, not for anything that lasts." The words struck harder than he likely intended. Clara's heart squeezed. She wanted to ask why, wanted to understand what sorrow pressed on him so heavily. But the warning in his tone left her silent. Elias tipped his hat back down, turning toward the door. "Best get inside, Miss Dawson. Night carries teeth out here." And with that, he left her on the porch, staring out at the rising stars, her chest full of questions she dared not speak. The following morning, Clara rose before the sun had fully broken the horizon. The cabin was still, the fire in the hearth nothing more than glowing embers. Elias was gone, out patrolling, she guessed, and the silence wrapped around her like both a comfort and a challenge. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He had made it clear, he was not a man to rely on, not someone who welcomed others into his world. And yet he had carried her from humiliation, given her shelter, and not once asked anything in return. That alone made her restless. She would not be a helpless guest, pitied as she had been in the church pew. "I will not be useless," she whispered into the morning air. Rolling up her sleeves, Clara set about tending the cabin. She swept the floor, her movement sharp and determined. She carried water from the well outside, the heavy pail straining her arms but firming her resolve. She found dried beans and salt pork in the cupboard and set a pot to simmer, adding herbs she recognized from her mother's garden back home. By the time Elias returned, the cabin smelled of stew, the floor shone, and Clara was bent over mending one of his worn shirts by the window light. He stepped through the door, boots heavy against the wood, and stopped short. His golden eyes swept the room, then landed on her. "What is all this?" Clara kept her chin lifted, though her fingers trembled around the needle. "I intend to earn my place here, Marshal. If I'm to stay, temporarily, I will work for it. I won't sit idle and expect your charity." For a long moment he said nothing. His gaze, sharp as a hawk's, searched her face. Then, to her surprise, the hard lines of his mouth eased, just slightly. "You're stubborn," he muttered, hanging his hat on the peg. Clara's lips curved faintly. "So I've been told." Elias moved to the table, ladling himself a bowl of stew. He ate in silence, but every now and then she caught his eyes on her, not cold, not pitying, but something far more dangerous: interest. It was near dusk when Clara ventured into town. Elias had gone to speak with the sheriff, leaving her with an errand of her own, to fetch flour from the mercantile. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her bonnet tied neatly beneath her chin, though she felt the burn of stares follow her every step. "Poor girl," she heard whispered, "bride left at the altar." "Marshal Kane took her in," another voice muttered. "Best she keep her head down." Clara lifted her chin higher. She had endured whispers before, she would endure them now. But as she passed the saloon, a shadow staggered into her path, The smell of whiskey hit her like a wall. "Well now," the man slurred, blocking her way, his eyes bloodshot and mean. "Ain't you the little bride who got herself jilted?" Shame. Real shame. "But don't fret, sweetheart. I'll keep you company." He reached for her arm. Clara jerked back, heart pounding. "Let me pass." The man chuckled, a sound as sour as the drink on his breath. "Pretty thing like you shouldn't walk alone. You need a man to—" His words cut short. A hand, strong as iron, clamped around the drunk's wrist. The man yelped as his arm was twisted back with a force that seemed far too much for a single man. Elias Kane stood there, golden eyes burning, his jaw tight. His voice was low, deadly calm. "Let her go." The drunk struggled, but Elias's grip didn't so much as tremble. His strength was inhuman. Clara could see it in the way the man's knees buckled, the way Elias held him as easily as a rag doll. For one terrifying instant, she thought Elias might snap the man's arm clean in two. "Marshal, please," the drunk gasped. Elias released him with a shove so sharp, the man stumbled into the dirt. "Get home before I forget the law keeps me from breaking you." The drunk scrambled away, cursing under his breath, but not daring to look back. Clara stood frozen, her pulse racing, her eyes fixed on Elias. His chest heaved once, twice, and then he turned to her. The gold in his gaze seemed to glow brighter in the fading light, fierce and untamed. "You shouldn't have come alone," he said, voice rough. Clara swallowed, her voice trembling. Your strength. It isn't—" She faltered, unable to finish. Elias looked away, pulling his hat low. "Best you don't ask questions you don't want answered." He offered his arm, not as a request, but as an order. And though her mind spun with fear and curiosity, Clara placed her hand on it, letting him lead her away, her heart whispering that Marshal Elias Kane was far more than he seemed. The cabin was quiet. Elias had left before dawn, called out on patrol, and Clara found herself alone with her restless thoughts. Sleep had not come easily the night before. Again and again she saw the drunk's terrified face, Elias's golden eyes blazing, and the raw strength in his hands. No man should have been able to hold another so effortlessly, and yet Elias had. Clara paced the small cabin, her heart thrumming with questions she dared not ask aloud. The silence pressed too heavily, and at last her eyes fell to the shelves lining one wall, sparse but carefully kept. She crossed the room, running her fingers over the spines of books worn with use. Not the usual dime novels or prayer books one might expect, but heavy volumes, natural histories, maps of Montana's wilderness, a journal with its leather cover scuffed and scarred. She traced the initials burned faintly into it, E.K., but did not open it. Beside the books stood weapons, polished and orderly. A rifle leaned in the corner, its barrel gleaming, and a long hunting knife rested in its sheath upon the table. But it was the claw marks, faint but undeniable, scratched across the wood near the knife that made Clara still. As if something with talons had dragged across it in a fit of rage, she turned slowly, her gaze catching on the far side of the room where a trunk sat half hidden beneath a blanket. After a moment's hesitation, she lifted the lid. Inside lay folded clothing, neatly kept. But beneath them was something stranger. A heavy chain, thick as her wrist, coiled like a serpent. She reached out, brushing the cold iron links. Chains not meant for restraining livestock or men. They felt ancient, dangerous. A chill prickled her skin. "Miss Dawson." The deep voice froze her in place. Clara spun, guilt flooding her, to see Elias framed in the doorway, his golden eyes fixed on her, unreadable, his shoulders tense. I wasn't—" She stumbled for words. "I was only tidying." His gaze dropped to the trunk, then returned to hers, sharp as a blade. "Some doors ought to stay closed." Clara's throat tightened. "Why do you keep chains, Marshal? And why does it feel as if they're not meant for anyone else but for you?" The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Elias stepped further inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet finality. "Because," he said at last, his voice low and rough. "There are nights when even the law cannot hold me." The nights in Montana were wide and endless, the stars burning like cold fire above the prairie. Clara lay awake, staring at the cabin ceiling as the wind whispered through the pines outside. She heard the sound again, the creak of boots, the soft jingle of spurs. Elias moving quietly, gathering his hat and rifle. Always the same. He thought she slept, but Clara had begun to notice the pattern. When the clock struck 10, the door opened, and Elias stepped into the dark. Clara rose from her bed, crossing to the window. She pulled the curtain just enough to see him. His broad figure cut against the moonlight, shoulders tense, his stride purposeful. Not the slow, thoughtful gait of a man on patrol, but something sharper, more restless. He disappeared into the trees, swallowed by the night. Clara pressed her fingers against the cool glass. Where does he go? The townsfolk spoke of bandits on the trails, of coyotes worrying livestock, but she knew in her bones, that Elias Kane was chasing something far more dangerous than ordinary threats. The memory of the chain coiled in the trunk haunted her, as did the claw marks gouged into the wood, and his eyes. Those golden, untamed eyes that seemed to glimmer brighter when the moonlight touched them. Clara shivered, pulling the shawl tight around her shoulders. Part of her wanted to stop thinking, to be grateful for his protection and nothing more, but her heart refused. Each night he vanished into the dark. Her curiosity grew sharper, twined with a pull she could not name. When he returned, always near dawn, he came with his jaw tight, his clothes dusted with dirt and pine needles, sometimes a fresh scratch along his arm or a shadow of exhaustion in his eyes. Clara never asked, not yet. But she wondered, feared, what truth might be waiting in the woods at night, and what it might mean for the man whose cabin she now called home. The moon was high when Clara made her choice. She could no longer stand lying awake, listening for the creak of the cabin door, wondering where Elias vanished to. This night she would follow. She slipped her shawl around her shoulders and moved barefoot across the wooden floor. The latch gave a soft click, and she winced, but Elias was already gone. The night air was sharp, carrying the pine-scented wind of the mountains. Clara kept to the shadows, trailing his path into the trees. The forest pressed close, branches groaning in the breeze. Her heart thundered with every step. Then came the sound, a howl, long and low, chilling her blood. Another answered, closer this time. Wolves. Clara froze, realizing too late her mistake. Shapes moved between the trees, eyes gleaming in the dark. A snarl broke the silence, and suddenly they were circling her, teeth flashing white in the moonlight. She stumbled back, her breath ragged. "No, stay back." The largest wolf lunged, and then Elias was there. He moved faster than her eyes could follow, a blur of shadow and firelight. His hand caught the wolf mid-leap, hurling the beast aside as though it weighed nothing. Another rushed him, and his fist struck with bone-cracking force. Snarls, yelps, the flash of teeth. Yet none could touch him. Clara's breath caught. He was not fighting like a man. His movements were too quick, too brutal, too wild. A wolf snapped at his arm, and for a heartbeat, Clara thought he'd fall. But Elias twisted, a growl tearing from his throat, so deep, so primal it didn't sound human. The pack faltered, ears flattening, before scattering into the night, tails tucked, their howls retreating. Silence crashed down, broken only by Clara's ragged breathing. Elias stood in the clearing, chest heaving, his eyes glowing gold like molten fire. His hands trembled as if holding back something far greater than fury. He turned to her. "Clara." His voice was raw, half a snarl, half a plea. "You shouldn't be here." She backed away a step, torn between terror and awe. What are you?" The moonlight struck his face, and for a fleeting instant she swore she saw the faint outline of something not quite human, a beast lurking beneath his skin. Elias closed his eyes, forcing his breath steady. "Go back to the cabin. Now." Clara hesitated, every instinct screaming to run. Yet her heart ached with a dangerous truth. The man who terrified her had also saved her, again. The walk back to the cabin was a blur. Clara's heart pounded with every step, her mind whirling with the images she had just witnessed, wolves scattering, Elias moving like no man should, his golden eyes burning in the dark. But when they reached the clearing by the cabin, she saw it. Elias stumbled, gripping the porch rail as though his body betrayed him. His breath came in harsh, ragged bursts, and a low growl rolled from his chest unbidden. "Stay back," he warned, his voice breaking. Clara froze. The shadows clung to him, but the moon caught his face and her breath caught in her throat. His features shifted just for a moment, as though something beneath the skin pressed to be free. His jaw stretched sharper, too long, his teeth glinting white and unnaturally pointed. His hands flexed, fingers curled into claws that caught the moonlight like polished steel. Half man, half beast. Clara gasped, stumbling back a step, one hand flying to her mouth. Elias turned from her, shoving his clawed hands against the rail as if wrestling himself back into control. A strangled sound left him, half snarl, half groan, before the change receded. Slowly, painfully, his form pulled itself back into the man she knew, the man whose eyes still burned with wild gold. At last he sagged against the post, shoulders heaving. Clara's whole body trembled. She had never believed such things possible, yet the proof had stood before her undeniable. You're not... The words failed her, but the truth filled the silence. Not just a man. Elias raised his head, meeting her gaze with eyes full of exhaustion and sorrow. "This is why I warned you, Clara." His voice was hoarse, heavy with shame. "This is what I am, what I've always been." Clara clutched her shawl tight, torn between fear and an aching pity that nearly broke her. She should run. Any woman with sense would run. But her feet refused to move, because no matter the beast she had glimpsed, it was still Elias Kane who had saved her life. Clara sat at the small table, her hands trembling around the edge of her shawl. The cabin felt too small, too close, as if the very walls pressed in with the weight of what she had witnessed. Across from her, Elias leaned against the doorframe, arms folded tightly across his chest. He wouldn't look at her. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders taut as though braced for a blow. The silence stretched. At last, Clara found her voice, thin, unsteady. "You're not a man. Not entirely." His golden eyes flicked to hers, sharp and pained. "No. And now you know why I warned you. Why you should never have followed me." Clara swallowed hard. Her fear lingered, sharp as ice in her veins. The memory of his claws, his half-shifted face, the animal growl, none of it could be erased. Part of her wanted to flee, to put miles between herself and whatever monster had shared this cabin with her. And yet, she could not ignore the other truth. The way he had stood before the wolves, unyielding. The way he had thrown himself between her and danger again and again. The loneliness in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. He was a protector, a man burdened, not just a beast unleashed. Clara's fingers knotted tighter in her shawl. "You saved me twice now. If you were only a monster, you wouldn't have." Elias's jaw flexed. "Don't try to make sense of it, Clara. Don't soften what I am. The beast isn't noble. It's violent, savage. One day it'll turn on someone who doesn't deserve it." Her heart twisted at the raw self-loathing in his tone. "You believe that, but I don't." He gave a harsh laugh, low and bitter, shaking his head. "Then, you're a fool." Clara flinched at the words, yet she did not look away. Fear still throbbed inside her, but fascination rooted her to her chair. She had seen the impossible and lived, and now she wanted to understand, even if it meant risking her heart to a man who wasn't entirely human. The fire crackled low in the hearth, shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Clara sat motionless, her shawl pulled tight, her gaze fixed on Elias. He stood with his back to her, staring into the flames as if searching for words that refused to come. At last he spoke. His voice was low, rough. "You deserve to know what you saw. I won't lie to you, Clara, not after tonight." Her pulse quickened. She leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. "I am a shifter," Elias said, the word falling heavy between them. "Part man, part beast. The wolf lives in my blood, it always has." He exhaled, shoulders rigid. "On the nights when the moon is full, or when the rage takes me, it comes through. I can't always stop it." Clara's lips parted, her mind spinning. It was one thing to glimpse his half-changed form in the shadows, another to hear him claim it openly. "A shifter," she whispered, tasting the word as though it were foreign. "Yes." His golden eyes flicked to hers, burning with a sorrow that twisted her chest. "That's why I live alone, why I keep my distance from the townsfolk, why I warned you again and again not to rely on me." He turned then, stepping closer, his voice fierce. "Because people who stand too close to me get hurt, and I won't let that happen to you." Clara swallowed hard. Fear still coiled within her, but beneath it, something warmer pulsed. Compassion, even admiration. He spoke not like a monster, but like a man carrying a burden too heavy for one soul. "Elias," she began softly, her voice trembling. "You've saved me every time I've needed it. How can I fear you when you've done nothing but protect me?" He flinched, as though her words wounded. "Because you don't know how dangerous I truly am." The firelight gleamed off the iron chain coiled near the hearth, silent proof of the war he waged with himself. Elias's voice broke low, hoarse. "Stay away from me, Clara, for your own sake." Her heart ached at the finality in his tone, but as he turned from her, she knew she could not obey. For the first time since her abandonment, she felt alive, not because of safety, but because of him. And no matter his warnings, her soul whispered that she was already far too close to turn back. Elias turned from her, shoulders bowed as though the weight of the world pressed upon him. The firelight painted his figure in shadow and gold, a man standing between two worlds, one human, one not. Clara rose slowly from her chair. Fear still lingered at the edges of her thoughts, sharp as the memory of claws and fangs. But stronger than fear was the truth she could no longer silence. "You say you're a danger," she said softly, her voice steadying with each word. "That the beast makes you something to fear. But that's not what I've seen." Elias's head lifted slightly, though he didn't turn. "I've seen a man who carried me out of a church when I fainted from shame," Clara continued, her steps bringing her closer. "A man who opened his home to me when no one else would, who faced down wolves with his bare hands." Her voice caught, but she pressed on. "And who stood between me and a drunk's fists without a second thought." At last, he turned, his golden eyes burning with conflict. "You don't understand." "No," she interrupted, her chin high. "I understand enough. You are not just a beast, Elias Kane. You are a man. The man who has protected me again and again. The man who has shown me more honor than the one I was meant to marry ever did." Silence crackled between them, as heavy as the fire in the hearth. Elias's jaw tightened, his chest rising and falling. For a moment, something flickered in his gaze. Hope, raw and dangerous. But then he shook his head, his voice breaking. "Clara, you don't know how easily the beast takes hold. You don't know what I've done when I lost control." Clara stepped closer, close enough that the heat of him brushed her skin. Her voice softened, trembling but true. "Maybe I don't know. But I know the man standing before me right now is not a monster, and I won't turn from him." The words hung between them, daring, unbreakable. Elias closed his eyes, as though her faith was a wound deeper than any blade, and for the first time in years, he felt the chains around his heart begin to strain. The days that followed carried an unfamiliar rhythm. Clara worked around the cabin, mending, cooking, keeping the fire alive, while Elias busied himself with patrols, chopping wood, and silent tasks that needed no words. Yet silence was no longer empty. Every glance lingered too long. Every brush of fingertips across a bowl passed at the table seemed to crackle in the air. Clara felt it like a current beneath her skin, something unspoken growing between them, dangerous and undeniable. One evening, as the sun sank in hues of rose and gold, Clara stood at the basin, wringing water from a cloth. Elias stepped behind her, close enough that she felt his warmth at her back. He reached past her for the kettle, his hand grazing hers by accident, or perhaps not accident at all. Clara froze, breath catching. Elias's golden eyes flicked down to hers, heat sparking in their depths. He held still for a heartbeat too long, then cleared his throat and stepped away, the kettle clattering louder than it should have. Later, when she stitched the tear in his shirt by lamplight, he sat across from her, watching. The glow of the flame cast his face in shadow, his gaze steady, unblinking. Clara's fingers fumbled with the thread, her cheeks warming under the weight of it. "You don't have to," he murmured at last. Clara's lips curved faintly. "I want to." Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither looked away. Something deep and unspoken hummed between them, fragile as glass, strong as steel. Elias broke first, leaning back with a rough exhale, as though the closeness burned him. But even as he turned aside, Clara caught the truth in his eyes. The man who had warned her again and again to stay away was fighting himself harder than he fought the beast. And part of her heart whispered he was losing. Night draped its cloak over the Montana wilds, the cabin quiet save for the low crackle of embers. Clara slept in the small room off the hearth, her breathing soft, steady, like a lullaby Elias had never known he needed. But sleep would not claim him. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling beams, every muscle wound tight. The wolf stirred beneath his skin, prowling, restless. It scented her, always her, the faint lavender of her hair, the warmth of her body, only a wall away. His jaw clenched as he turned onto his side. Images he fought to bury rose unbidden, her eyes meeting his without fear, her hand brushing his when she passed him a dish, the curve of her lips when she smiled, despite her sorrow. The wolf growled in his chest, a low aching sound that burned in his veins. "Mate," it whispered, savage and certain. "Ours." Elias sat up sharply, running a hand over his face, forcing the beast down. "No," he muttered under his breath, breath harsh. "She deserves better than this. Better than me." But when he closed his eyes, the dreams came anyway. Clara's touch, gentle against his cheek, her lips parting as he leaned in. The heat of her body pressed close, his control shattering as the wolf howled in triumph. He jolted awake with a groan, sweat dampening his skin. His nails bit into his palms, half shifted, fighting the urge to break the fragile peace of the night. From the other room, Clara stirred softly, sighing in her sleep. Elias dragged in a ragged breath, burying his face in his hands. He had faced outlaws, beasts, and the curse of his own blood, but nothing threatened to undo him like the quiet, unassuming woman who now slept under his roof. And for the first time in years, Elias Kane feared not the monster within him, but the man. The night air was crisp, the mountains breathing a hush through the pines. Clara sat on the porch step, her shawl pulled around her shoulders, staring at the stars. Elias stood a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the dark tree line, every muscle taut as though he were standing guard against an unseen enemy. She watched him in silence for a moment, the strong lines of his face softened by moonlight. He was always like this, alert, protective, as though danger might spring from the shadows at any moment. "You don't have to stand watch every night," Clara said gently. Elias's head tilted slightly, but he didn't turn. "Be careful what you stir, Thomas. The truth isn't always kind to the man who speaks it." The two men faced each other, tension stretched like a drawn bowstring, while Clara's heart thundered with the knowledge that Thomas's venom had struck deeper than any weapon. For even if Elias could face him down, the seed of suspicion was planted, and if the town turned against him, Elias might lose everything. The next time Clara went into town, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. Women lingered by the mercantile, voices dropping low when she passed. Men at the blacksmith's paused mid-conversation, their gazes flicking toward the Marshal's cabin in the hills. It was in the air, unease, suspicion, curiosity sharpened into fear. "Strange, isn't it?" a shopkeeper murmured just loud enough for Clara to hear. "How the Marshal never seems to age, never falls sick. And those eyes of his," another voice whispered, saw him out past the ridge on a moonlit night, moving faster than any man ought to. Reckon Thomas might be right. He's not natural. Clara's cheeks burned, her heart pounding as she clutched her basket tighter. She wanted to shout the truth, that Elias had saved more lives than Thomas ever would, that his solitude was born of sacrifice, not sin. But the words stuck in her throat, strangled by the tide of judgment. Later, when she returned to the cabin, Elias was already waiting by the fire. He didn't ask what she had heard. He knew. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes glowed faintly, the wolf close to the surface. "They're whispering, aren't they?" he said quietly, without looking at her. Clara hesitated, then nodded. "They don't understand you. They twist what they don't know into fear." A bitter smile ghosted across his lips. "They always do. That's why I stay apart. It's easier when the world sees you as a shadow." Her chest ached at the resignation in his voice. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his sleeve. "But you're not a shadow to me." His gaze flicked to her, sharp and burning, as though her words were both salvation and torment. Outside, the whispers spread like dry grass catching flame, and Clara knew the town's suspicion was no passing thing. It was a storm gathering on the horizon, one that would test them both. The town square buzzed with restless energy. A knot of townsfolk gathered near the saloon. Thomas stood at the center, his words sharp as a whip, his hands waving dramatically as he spun his tale. "I tell you, he's not a man like us," Thomas declared, his voice carrying. "He skulks in the wild, stronger than 10 men, eyes glowing like some beast. Would you trust such a creature with the safety of our children? With the safety of your wives?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Fear mingled with doubt, faces hardening as suspicion grew roots. At the edge, Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She saw how quickly Thomas's poison spread, how close the people were to turning against the only man who had ever truly protected them. Before fear could stop her, Clara stepped forward. Her voice rang out, clear and steady, slicing through the noise. "You speak lies, Thomas." The crowd stilled, heads snapping toward her. Thomas's face flushed with shock before twisting into a sneer. "Ah, the Marshal's little stray. Of course you'd defend him. He's bewitched you, same as the rest." Clara's chin lifted, fire burning in her eyes. "Elias Kane has done more for this town than you ever have. When wolves threatened, he stood between them and your flocks. When drunks raised fists, he kept peace. When no one else would take in a forsaken bride, he did so without question or shame." The murmurs shifted, unease turning to surprise. A few men shuffled, remembering nights Elias had dragged them home safe from the saloon. Women whispered of children who slept soundly because the Marshal's patrols kept danger at bay. Thomas sputtered, his confidence faltering. Clara shot back, her voice rising. "You abandoned me at the altar, left me to humiliation, and now you dare speak of honor? Tell me, townsfolk, who here has truly acted the monster?" The silence that followed was thunderous. Thomas's face darkened, but the crowd wavered, doubt flickering in their eyes. Not of Elias, but of him. Clara's breath trembled, but she held her ground, heart blazing. For the first time, she stood not as the abandoned bride, but as a woman who had chosen her side, and all of Montana would remember it. The ride back from town was silent, the horses' hooves striking the dirt road in steady rhythm. Clara sat tall, despite the weight of the stairs still burning in her memory, while Elias's jaw was set like stone, his gaze fixed on the horizon. When they reached the cabin, he dismounted without a word, tying the reins with quick, sharp movements. Clara slid down after him, heart thudding. The silence between them was worse than anger. It was distance. Inside, Elias paced by the hearth, his broad shoulders tight. Finally, he stopped, turning toward her. His eyes glowed faintly gold, stormy with emotions she could not name. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice low, hoarse. "Standing before them like that? Do you realize what it means?" Clara lifted her chin, though her pulse hammered. "It means I told the truth, that you are not the monster Thomas paints you to be." He shook his head, running a hand through his hair, restless. You don't understand. Every word you spoke bound you to me in their eyes. You've painted a target on your own back, Clara. They'll turn on you next." She stepped closer, determination sparking in her eyes. "Let them whisper. Let them doubt. I know who you are, Elias." His chest rose sharply, as though her faith was both a gift and a wound. He reached for her, then stopped, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You don't know what you've done," he murmured, voice breaking. "I can live with their suspicion. I can live as an outcast, but you—" He swallowed hard, shaking his head. "You shouldn't have to bear that weight, not for me." Her hand brushed his arm, gentle, stubborn. "I'm not afraid of them. I'm afraid of losing the only man who has ever made me feel safe." His eyes closed, anguish tightening his features. "Clara, if you stay by my side, I will destroy your life." The words hung between them like a vow, heavy and unyielding. He turned away, retreating into the shadows of the cabin, leaving Clara trembling in the firelight. For the first time she understood. His greatest fear was not the wolf within him, it was himself. Clara stood in the glow of the hearth, her hands trembling, but her eyes steady on Elias's back. He had retreated into the corner of the cabin, half-shadowed, as though distance could shield her from him. But she was done with distance. "You think you're protecting me," she said, her voice ringing louder than she meant it to. "But all you're doing is building a wall I can't break through. You tell me to stay away, to be safe, to let you carry everything alone. I won't." Elias stiffened, his broad shoulders rising with a harsh breath. "Clara, no." She crossed the room, placing herself squarely in front of him, forcing him to meet her gaze. Her heart pounded, but fire burned in her chest. "You say you'll destroy me if I stay, but don't you see? You're already destroying me by pushing me away." His golden eyes flickered, raw and pained. "You don't know what you're asking." "Then tell me," she shot back, her voice breaking with the force of it. "Tell me everything. Trust me with the whole truth, your wolf, your curse, your past, all of it. Stop carrying this burden as if you're the only soul strong enough to bear it." Elias's hands curled at his sides, claws pricking at his fingertips as the beast stirred. "If you knew the things I've done, the nights I've lost control, you'd run from me." Clara stepped closer still, so close she could feel the heat radiating off his body. "Then let me choose. Don't decide for me. Don't lock me out of your heart because you're afraid. Trust me, Elias, or you'll lose me." The silence that followed was thunderous, broken only by the crackle of flames. Elias's breath came ragged, his gaze fixed on hers as though she were the only light in a world of shadows. At last, his voice broke low, almost a growl. "You don't know what you're asking for, Clara." Her hand lifted, brushing his jaw with trembling fingers. "Then show me. Let me carry the truth with you." And for the first time, Elias Kane felt the chains around his heart strain to breaking. Elias turned from Clara's touch, pacing as though the cabin walls were too close, too suffocating. For a long time he said nothing, only the crackle of the fire filling the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like gravel dragged over stone. "I wasn't always alone," he began. "Years ago there was someone, before I came to Montana, a woman who swore she loved me, despite what I was." Clara's breath caught, but she held his gaze, steady, patient. Elias's eyes glowed faintly, the wolf restless under his skin as he spoke. "For a while I believed her. I thought maybe I could have a life like other men. A home, a family, a future not haunted by the beast inside me. But the wolf is never silent. One night it broke through, I lost control." His jaw tightened, voice harsh with memory. "When I came back to myself, she was gone. She'd run screaming into the night, swearing I was a monster." Clara's chest ached at the pain etched in his words. Elias turned away, staring into the flames. "After that, I swore never to let anyone close again, never to risk the shame of their fear or the weight of their betrayal. So I built a life alone. Lawman by day, beast by night, safer that way for everyone." He looked back at her then, his expression raw, stripped of all defenses. "Do you see now, Clara? I can't love. Not without destroying everything I touch. Her throat tightened, tears stinging her eyes, but she stepped closer, her hand reaching for his. Elias, she whispered, her voice trembling. You think love is what broke you. But it wasn't love, it was fear. Hers, not yours. His golden eyes searched hers, fierce with pain and disbelief. Clara's hand squeezed his, steady and sure. I'm not her, and I will not run from you. The words sank into him like a balm, soothing wounds left raw for years. For the first time since his vow of solitude, Elias felt the faintest spark of something he had long thought dead, hope. The firelight painted shadows across Elias's face, his features torn between despair and longing. His hand remained in hers, heavy, calloused, trembling as though it carried the weight of every sin he had ever known. Clara tightened her grip, forcing him to look at her. Elias Kane, she whispered, her voice fierce despite the tears burning her eyes. I will not run. Not from your scars, not from your secrets, not from the wolf inside you. I see you, all of you, and I am not afraid. His breath caught, sharp and ragged. You should be. No. She stepped closer until there was no space left between them, her chin lifting stubbornly. I've lived through fear already, fear of rejection, of being abandoned, of being nothing more than a burden. I will not live that way again. I would rather face your wolf than face a life without truth, or without you. For a heartbeat, silence pressed thick between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire and the pounding of his heart that she swore she could feel through the air. Elias's golden eyes burned, flickering like molten metal as the beast stirred, testing her courage. You don't understand what it means to be bound to a shifter. Once you step into my world, there is no turning back. You will carry my strength and my darkness with you. Dust billowed as a gang of armed bandits rode hard into town, shouting threats that sent townsfolk scrambling for cover. Marshal Elias Kane was on the street in an instant, revolver drawn, eyes blazing with lethal focus. But before he could fire, the bandit leader, a scarred man with a cruel grin, dragged two townsfolk into the open, guns pressed to their heads. Not so fast, lawman, the leader bellowed. Drop your weapon, or they die. Elias's blood ran cold as his gaze swept the captives. His heart stopped. Clara stood among them, her wrists seized in a bandit's grip, her face pale but defiant. Every muscle in Elias's body tightened with rage. The wolf inside him surged, snarling for blood, for release, for vengeance. His vision sharpened, golden heat flickering in his eyes as his beast pushed against the fragile cage of his restraint. The bandit leader sneered, holding Clara tighter as he spotted Elias's reaction. Well, well, looks like the Marshal has himself a sweetheart. That makes things easier. You're gonna watch while we bleed this town dry. Clara's gaze found Elias's, steady despite the fear trembling in her body. In her eyes, he read both terror and trust that he would not fail her. But how could he save her without revealing the monster he had fought so long to keep hidden? The wolf howled within him, promising strength enough to tear the bandits apart, if he dared unleash it. Elias's hand tightened on his revolver. His secret hung by a thread. One wrong choice, and Clara, and the entire town, would see the truth he had buried for years. The bandit pressed a pistol hard against Clara's temple, and Elias felt something inside him snap. He dropped his revolver. The bandits jeered, thinking they'd won. But Elias Kane was already shifting. His body trembled, bones reshaping with sickening cracks, muscles swelling as golden fire lit his eyes. Claws burst from his fingertips, and a low, primal growl rolled from his chest, so deep it rattled the windows of the saloon. The jeers turned to startled cries. Clara gasped, her eyes wide, but not with horror. She saw the man beneath the beast, the protector she knew. Before the bandit could pull the trigger, Elias moved. He was faster than sight, a blur of fur and fury. With one swipe, he sent the outlaw flying. Gunshots exploded, but Elias was already among them, tearing weapons from hands, disarming, striking, breaking. His claws glinted in the lantern light, his fangs bared as he roared. The townsfolk watched in stunned silence, half believing they were seeing a nightmare born of legend. The Marshal they knew was gone, replaced by a towering wolfman, a predator of impossible power. But to Clara, it was still Elias. He ripped the ropes from her wrists with one sharp slash, pulling her behind him with protective force. His chest heaved, breath wild, as he turned on the last of the bandits, eyes burning gold, teeth bared in a snarl that promised death. Within minutes, the street was littered with groaning, broken outlaws. Not one dared rise under the beast's gaze. And then, silence. The wolf stood panting in the dust, his massive frame silhouetted against the moonlight. The town stared, trembling, whispers rising like fearful wind. Clara stepped forward, her hand reaching toward him, unafraid. "Elias," she whispered, her voice steady as her heart thundered. The beast's ears twitched. Slowly, impossibly, golden eyes softened. He had saved her. But in doing so, his secret was no longer hidden. The silence after the fight was broken not by cheers, but by gasps. Then the whispers started, hissing, fearful, spreading like wildfire. "Did you see his eyes? Claws, like a wolf. He's not a man at all." Mothers clutched children closer. Men who had once trusted Elias stepped back as if he were diseased. A single bottle slipped from someone's hand and shattered on the ground, the sound making Clara flinch, though Elias stood still as stone. The Marshal who had defended their town for years was gone in their eyes. In his place was a monster of flesh and fur. One old rancher spat on the ground. "Devil's work," he muttered, voice shaking. "That's what he is, a beast walking among us." Another cried out, "And we trusted him to uphold the law?" Fear turned quickly to anger. A stone flew, striking Elias's shoulder, not enough to hurt him, but enough to pierce the moment. Murmurs swelled to shouts, rage rising in the crowd. Clara stepped in front of Elias, arms outstretched, her voice ringing over the chaos. "Stop! Can you not see what he has done? He saved us. Every single one of you owes him your lives." But the crowd only wavered, torn between gratitude and terror. Their eyes flicked to the broken bandits lying moaning in the street, then back to the beast standing over them. Elias's claws curled tight into his palms, chest heaving as shame and fury warred within him. He had never feared battle, but this, the betrayal in the eyes of the people he had sworn to protect, cut deeper than any blade. He lowered his head, golden eyes dimming, the weight of their fear pressing down on him heavier than chains. The mob surged, their fear curdling into fury. Torches flickered to life, stones gripped in shaking hands. Elias stood unmoving, his broad frame tense, ready to take their judgment if it kept Clara safe. But before the first man could strike, Clara ran forward and threw herself in front of him, arms wide, her voice sharp and fierce enough to cut through the storm. "Enough!" she cried, her chest heaving. "You call him monster. But where were you when the bandits came? Who among you stood against them? None. Not one. It was Elias who saved you. Elias who saved me." The crowd wavered, muttering, their anger faltering beneath her fire. She turned then, her eyes shining, not at them but at him. Her voice dropped, trembling but sure. "I don't care what you are, Elias Kane. Man or beast, wolf or lawman, you are the one who carried me when I fell, who protected me when I was abandoned, who has never let me face this world alone, and I love you, do you hear me? I love you." A gasp rippled through the crowd, scandalous and raw. Clara, the forsaken bride, daring to love the Marshal-turned monster. Elias's golden eyes widened, the beast within him stilled by her words more than by any chain. For the first time in years, hope flickered in his chest, hope not born of solitude or secrecy, but of love spoken boldly, even in the face of hate. The mob faltered, confusion rippling through them. Fear still lingered, but so did doubt. If the abandoned bride could stand unflinching at the side of a shifter, then perhaps the Marshal was not the devil they feared. But not all hearts were swayed, and in the shadow of the saloon, Thomas's eyes burned with venom. The crowd murmured, divided between fear and doubt, but Thomas's fury burned hotter than either. He shoved through the townsfolk, face twisted with rage, a pistol gleaming in his hand. "There!" he shouted, voice cracking with venom. "You see? She's bewitched. This beast has cursed her, cursed us all, and I'll end it before he brings hell down on Montana." Gasps broke from the crowd as he raised his gun. Clara screamed, throwing herself tighter against Elias's chest. Time seemed to slow. Elias could have shifted, could have torn Thomas apart in an instant, but he stayed still, refusing to let his wolf strike down a man he had once sworn to protect. The shot rang out, sharp, deafening, but Thomas's aim faltered in the chaos. A rancher, trying to wrestle the gun away, jostled his arm. The bullet grazed Elias's shoulder, blood spraying hot against Clara's dress. Elias snarled in pain, but before he could react, the mob surged. Half in fear, half in fury, men grabbed at Thomas, wrenching the pistol from his hand.